Very welcome, all of you awesome human beings whom I hope is here. Yes, dropping in. Wonderful. It's great to have you here and in this webinar on artificial intelligence, ethics, and sustainability, and actually life on Earth. Hosted by End Ecocide Sweden, Ecocide Law Alliance, and the Earth Lab of the International Engineering Organization, IEEE. My name is Pella Thiel, and you will also hear from Jonas Ropé and Andre Uhl, who will introduce themselves shortly. Artificial intelligence is an exponentially growing field of technology, a powerful force. But so far, an unintended consequence of any technology has often been exploitation of the living world, a process which has gone so far that it threatens human well-being and even life as we know it. So we have been asking in the introduction of this webinar a thought that we borrowed from our friend Kishore, if maybe AI could be the new plastic, something that seems incredibly useful and efficient, but after a while becomes a nuisance or even a threat. So we will explore how a proposed new crime of ecocide can serve as a powerful ethical framework for AI and govern it in a benign direction as a force for sustainable development. So please participate by asking questions in the Q&A and use the chat to connect with us and with each other. And welcome to this webinar on the nexus between transformative technology and transformative law. And I will like Andre, if you could introduce yourself and tell us who you are, and also after that, Jonas.
Thank you, Pella, and hello, everyone. My name is Andre Uhl. I am currently Technology and Innovation Fellow at Harvard University's Planetary Health Alliance, which is a global consortium of over 270 universities, NGOs, and governmental agencies, supporting interdisciplinary research on the health implications of anthropogenic change in Earth's natural systems. Previously, I completed my PhD also at Harvard University, where I explored the ethics and governance of artificial intelligence through the post-human predicament of climate change. And I guess this is kind of the thread that also brings us to this meeting today. Out of my own research practice emerged a working group that is now being hosted at the IEEE Standards Association, which is the standard setting body of the world's largest association of technical professionals. It is called the Ieee Earth Lab, and in it we are exploring ecocentric approaches to the ethics and governance of AI with the aim to foster breakthrough innovation for climate justice. And within this working group, I also had the pleasure to be working with Pella and Jonas and get familiar with some of the concepts around Earth law and ecocide. And I very much look forward to this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And my name is Jonas Ropé. I am engaged in the Ecocide Law Alliance, which I co-founded, and I have a background in engineering. Actually started with computer programming a long time ago, engineering and economy, and studied psychology for 3 years. And I've been actively engaged in circular economy and ecocide law for almost 10 years. And my professional background is I've been working as a management consultant or as a executive in global companies with business development, understanding what happens in the environment, business intelligence officer or things like that, chief marketing officer, with the focus almost all the time on sustainability, but never with that mantle. So I've been head of strategy, but really concerned about what happens in nature. And the business focus we have in the Ecocide Law Alliance, that is really to enroll the support for businesses, companies around the world in support of Ecocide Law. It has a strong logic, because if you invest in sustainable practices, the business conditions greatly improves by Ecocide Law, and it becomes more difficult to take shortcuts for which is a very good idea. And the large majority of people in the business sector really wants a sustainable development and are trapped in a system. So it is really a powerful tool, Ecocide Law, to make everything else they want possible. So I'm quite excited about that. And over to you, Pella, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Jonas and Andre. And I'm an ecologist and the co-founder and currently chairperson of Ecocide Sweden. And I'm working with, so I'm not into law at all. I'm going to talk to you about law, but that's not really my professional field. But I have been working now for almost a decade with law as a transformative tool for human development in harmony with nature. So I'm an expert in the UN Harmony with Nature program. And it's incredibly interesting to think about law as not just important in itself, but also around how we think about ourselves and the world. And Ecocide Law is one of the most concrete and powerful pieces of the puzzle to reach a sustainable development. So I want to introduce that to you in a very short time span. So we know that now that no development is possible at all if we don't have healthy ecosystems. All the values that we need to protect, like human rights, biodiversity, a stable climate, justice, food security, and peace, need us to respect and protect nature. But actually today, law prevents us from protecting nature and enables exploitation. There's no legal framework applicable for all international actors in place to end impunity on environmental damage and hold top decision makers to account. So the legal support for a transition to sustainability and to a regenerative rather than exploitative development is missing. And that's why we are part of a movement proposing that ecocide, mass damage and destruction of nature should be added as a fifth crime against peace at the international level, at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the ICC. The ICC handles the most serious crimes of concern to the whole international community. And the governing document of the ICC is called the Rome Statute, and it contains 4 crimes, and I think you're familiar with those. It's war crimes, crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And given the ecological crisis, which affect all humans and all living beings now and in the future, it's really urgent and necessary to add a 5th crime, the crime of ecocide. This idea is actually not new. The concept was mentioned already 5 decades ago by, among others, the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. And during the last year, we have seen an enormous surge in interest in ecocide as a crime, with faith leaders, business leaders, investors, and not least youth groups as proponents, and also a number of states who are parties to the Rome Statutes who express interest. And this is partly following the introduction or the proposal of a definition of ecocide as a crime, which our umbrella organization Stop Ecocide International has presented from an independent panel of legal experts. And I'm sure the definition will be posted in the chat for you to read, but I can also read it. So ecocide as an international crime in the Rome Statute means unlawful, or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, international cooperation on the environmental arena isn't new either. I mean, there are hundreds, I think around 2,000 international treaties and conventions on the environment, but still almost every parameter is going in the wrong direction. And why is that? Because all of those frameworks are so-called soft law. They're agreements. They're basically nice words on a paper, but there's no consequence if you don't comply. Ecocide law, on the other hand, is criminal law on the international level, hard law with personal accountability for the people in power, those who have the power to make the most important decisions with consequences for us all. And we are not particularly keen on seeing people in the dock in The Hague. That's not what this proposal is about. But the ecocide as a crime will work preemptively. Even just discussing this legal piece will work preemptively. So what it's about is creating a law for life, new rules in common for all that we all have to follow, which will level the playing field, as Jonas said, and create a future in harmony with nature, which is also necessary for a future in peace. So that is one piece of the puzzle that we're discussing today. And the other one is the transformative technology on artificial intelligence. And Andre will introduce you to that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bella. I'm going to share my screen now for a short presentation. And I believe all of you who are attending today have heard in some form about artificial intelligence, probably many times, probably on a weekly or daily basis. It's one of the hottest topics right now, actually, to talk about. It's the frontier of development, and it comes with great hopes and fears. There are hopes that artificial intelligence can foster breakthrough solutions for climate mitigation, but also there are a lot of concerns about the risks surrounded by the ethical implications of it. And a lot what we are hearing about seems to be already a quite advanced conversation, but to open up our space of exploration here, I would actually like to pose a very simple question. What is AI? We hear it so many times, but many of us don't really understand actually what is behind the term artificial intelligence, right? A simple Google image search reveals that, at least visually, we associate AI a lot with kind of humanoid robots, wired brains, images of human and machine dialoguing with each other. It's a very human-centric idea, how artificial intelligence is evolving and coming into our lives. And that, interestingly, also correlates with many of the narratives that have been shaped by visual culture in the US and Europe over the last decades. So here's just a collage of different screenshots from movies that have portrayed AI. There have been hundreds of movies actually out there that made AI a topic in their plots. And most of these stories are also depicting AI in the form of robots or cyborgs. In most cases, there are issues with their functioning. So a lot of times they malfunction and create a lot of damage. A lot of times there are power dynamics and struggles between human-machine relationship. And what we can see here is sort of a collective sensitivity around sort of underlying fears regarding the onset and emergence of this new technology that is still in the making and whose outcomes are quite hard to anticipate. But in recent years, when I started to explore the ethics and governance of artificial intelligence academically, it seemed like that this particular collective imagination also spilled into a more serious academic discourse. So we have seen the emergence and proliferation of AI ethics initiatives, research groups, and think tanks across sectors. And this is an image developed by a group of researchers from the Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. It's a principled artificial intelligence project that in 2019 looked at some of the most influential AI ethics and governance papers and reports that were published at that time. And they looked at basically overarching themes, shared principles that could basically be seen as an emerging consent around how we ethically govern this emerging technology. And what this team of researchers has found is that there are certain categories that are cross-cutting across all these different initiatives. And these include concerns about privacy, accountability, safety and security, transparency and explainability, fairness and non-discrimination, human control of technology, professional responsibility, the promotion of human values. And all of these, as you can tell, are embedded in the framework of human rights. So it is quite telling what you can see here, that the paradigm of human-centric design has basically been the underlying foundation for a lot what recently has come up in the space of AI research. A very important discourse, of course, but within the context of this particular group here, it is also quite interesting to see the lack for the question of environmental sustainability and climate change. It is almost the elephant in the room. And so this is again bringing us back to the question, what is AI and how have we come to think about these ethical frameworks that ought to govern it, right? And for this reason, I would like to bring us back one more time to the actual beginnings of AI as a field of academic research. Many people point the beginnings to the infamous Dartmouth summer workshop hosted by a group of computer scientists at Dartmouth College in 1956. And within their proposal, there was the proposition that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. And I would like to emphasize this particular nuance that the early research narrative around AI has modeled here. So what is becoming clear here, that the beginnings of AI research did not look in the possibility of creating an intelligent machine, but rather a machine that could simulate intelligent behavior. And we can discuss later in more detail what kind of implication it has to be aware of these nuances. But what I want to point out here in this first introduction is that soon after AI was founded as a research program, the emerging computer industry of the 1960s, 70s, 80s fostered a notion of exponential growth. So there was an observation that computing hardware did not only become increasingly affordable to produce, but also increasingly capable and efficient. And so many popular scientific discourses surrounding the question of AI ethics and governance in previous decades has actually viewed the original research agenda of AI researchers through the lens of this exponential growth paradigm, so that there was this assumption being born that we would also see an exponential growth of intelligent machines, an intelligence explosion, which then manifested in the so-called singularity narrative that I believe all of you are familiar of, the idea that machines will constantly become able to upgrade themselves until they basically become more powerful actors than humans, and we lose control over their governance. And at that point, it is basically up to us either to merge with them or find ways how to safeguard their further development. This is a very, of course, simplistic overview with regard to the brevity of time we have, but I want to just point out the different concepts that really are influential to our thinking around AI to date. And one missing piece to this entire conversation that I already mentioned previously is something that actually around a similar time has been published by a seminal work of the Club of Rome, which is basically highlighting the limits to growth, right? And if you look at their chart of industrial development, you can also tell that actually right now, at this point in time, we are at the peak, or if not also already after the peak of this industrial growth era. And we can see here that there is this notion with every exponential growth comes exponential decline. So at this point, with all the concerns that Pella has raised, we also need to redefine our understanding around frontier technologies and the ethical governance frameworks that we want to apply to those. So my proposition here for this particular conversation is, do we really want to view AI as the threatening other that we need to learn how to safeguard with human-centric design principles? Do we even want to see it as a friendly technology that can serve our needs? Or do we also need to consider basically its impact on the environmental crisis? The question is, are we engineering ourselves to death? As it is so pointedly illustrated or visualized here by photographer Chris Jordan in his image. So my opening question for our conversation is, can AI exist with, for, or as nature? And what kind of governance frameworks do we need to develop in order to have an ecocentric approach to our discourse? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. This is so exciting questions, and I'm thinking of this of course also brings the question then, what is nature? And I think that a fundamental difference between AI and nature is that nature is alive and therefore complex, while artificial intelligence is merely complicated. And so what I am curious about is, can the machine, the complicated machine, can it serve the living complex world? And Jonas, you have written a lot about this, and you even have a report that we're launching today, and we will send it to all of you afterwards. What did you find? Jonas is probably muted, I suppose.
I am now online. Thank you for helping me. So here is the report, and I think you were able to read it perhaps. So adding Ecocide Law as a framework for governance. And it's a rather strong governance framework. A lot of the discussion is, I think, naive in the world today, where people expect soft agreements and soft types of laws to really shift the system, where the incentives takes us the wrong way. That will not happen. And I'd like, I think, to start with taking us all back to 1995. Do you remember where you were in 1995? I remember where I was. I just graduated and I went into R&D as a research engineer. And in the university, we had internet. The executives in the company I joined didn't have internet, or they just got mail. We were really in an analog world. So the executives, not me, had mobile phones, and the telecommunication networks were dumb networks, electrical, and with a cord. So now, 2022, we are in a digital world, really ripe for artificial intelligence, that in itself has no morals. it will take us to whatever objective we put, or those in power put, as fast as possible, as efficient as possible, with dazzling capacity. But will it be taken where we want? So also 1995 was the year when UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, were started. And it has really been difficult for them to govern their objectives. And also 1995 was the year when Ecocide Law almost made it to the Rome Statute, as Pella took you through. And I cannot help to imagine what world we would be living in if we had internet by that time, and people would have known the 5 countries that said the environment isn't important enough for an international law, and human rights isn't really connected to problems with the environment anyway. 5 nations stopped something that was on the verge of had big support. And of course, already with the word Extinction Rebellion, you have the connection between basic human rights and the environment. And let's see if I can take us, so the drivers of environmental degradation, I think, could be a good starting point. So this is from UNEP and Interpol, the rise of environmental crime, a growing threat to natural resources, peace, development, and security is the name of the report. And they have 5. So lack of law enforcement, a large problem with protection of the planet and the life on the planet today is not that we lack laws necessarily nationally, but they aren't enforced. We have a lack of legislation, both international and national, a big gap when it comes to making it a crime to destroy the environment in a large scale. So that is the gap that Ecocide Law would fill or will fill. We have increasing demand, domestic and international. We have, and you could say this lack of legislation enforcement and an ever-increasing demand on natural resources is making very good opportunities for corruption, conflict of resources, mafias, and corporate crime. And what is interesting is, of course, how this could be intervened. So Ecocide Law does a few things. So it makes the most wanton, that is reckless and disproportional practices of ecocide an international crime. So it adds, first of all, the gap, or fixes the gap of international legislation, but also it acts, the International Criminal Court with the Rome Statute can act as a court of last resort when for some reason national courts cannot or don't dare to take on the case. The worst criminals can be locked away. So Ecocide Law doesn't go after, it goes for the worst and the most wanton cases. So it doesn't go after those that really want to try and use good practices. But there are always those that don't want to even try. So you can lock those away. And that addresses, at one level at least, mafias, corporate crime, and corruption in many ways. And also quite interesting with Ecocide Law, it improves business conditions for regenerative alternatives and shifts the risk. So now you have good margins and not so big risk of not following laws. You get competitive advantage, but with Ecocide Law that will shift. So not following laws will be much more dangerous, more difficult to insure, much more difficult to sell. And artificial intelligence will help us with that. I'll go into that. So you could say that is powerful for shifting or perhaps decoupling even the link between natural resources and the development of the economy and the society, and also alleviate much of the core problem with resource conflicts. And Another thing that I'll come back to is the preemptive effect prior to business decisions and before the business case are decided, even with Ecocide Law. So the discussion in the boardroom or in the business development area or in the local company is, can we be sure that this mining operation or this textile plant or whatever you're into, can we be sure that it will not be that it will not lead to ecocide or be connected to ecocide? And if the answer is then no, we cannot be sure, then the conversation that follows will be, I could be jailed for this, and so would you. So we cannot take this ahead until we must find a better way or make really sure that it won't happen. So you have a preemptive effect. So if you want to change the minds and the creativity of millions of people, this is a very good idea. And also, I'll come back to it, a moral baseline is established and norms are shifted. So this is, you could say, a softer thing, but probably the most powerful. So that is ecocide interventions on the system. And the last two, connects to all these drivers. Artificial intelligence helps us to identify ecocide fast. It could speed up the case file, making case files and shorten, you can say, time to justice greatly. And so that, you could say, will help with law enforcement and corruption and mafias and corporate crime as well. And there's another or two other quite interesting things. So matchmaking between secondary resources and whoever would have a use for them and could pay good for them, that is made easier also with Ecocide. So for instance, I used to be chief marketing officer at a recycling company. And when you had big customers that had big secondary materials, you needed to find a really good expert and then dig a lot. And then you could see that you have best practices in Canada and in Brazil, for instance, for the particular practice and material they have than in northern Sweden in that case. But with AI, that could be done so much faster. And you could also fine-tune your regenerative and circular practices. So that is also supporting then decoupling growth and alleviating resource conflicts. And also, and I cannot see what I've written, increased transparency, for instance, in value chain and then address incongruencies. So that is supportive of all. So the drivers of environmental degradation have very powerful interventions that are complementary for artificial intelligence and Ecocide Law, which I think is quite interesting. And I should say, so it's not exhaustive. There are more links. They're also partly overlapping. So I'm pretty sure that some of you or all of you have found other things that I didn't mention, but just as a brief overview. And many people, having worked in business development and in circular economy, many people say, which is kind of counterintuitive in a way, but nothing is so helpful for creativity as a clear parameter. I have so many stories for that, but it's very true. So if you know that now we are shifting the baseline, now we are shifting what we consider acceptable, that will be very helpful for creativity and speed up, but also improving and getting a fair, predictable business environment is very helpful as well. And that is most of the energy when you are in business development is you cannot predict, if you can rely on these frameworks or on the society actually making things happen as politicians are saying. So you need predictable business conditions, and it's really helpful. And one thing that isn't talked so much about when it comes to artificial intelligence is the creative aspect. And you could, after the seminar, perhaps have a look at this video. It's 3 minutes long, and it's really interesting about these two very happy fine cuisine chefs, very happy about how artificial intelligence helps them with amazing cooking and making amazing connections. And it so happens that most people cannot connect more than 3 flavors at the same time, whereas a computer could match and learn what we find surprising, delicious, and interesting when it comes to food, and then match and combine a harmony of many, many, many more tastes. And this aspect of artificial intelligence is very helpful for a lot of other industries and sectors, as the video also will take you through, than food. So, and then to start to wrap up, so Donella Meadows, as Andre also mentioned with her book, is she was an amazing systems thinker. And if you imagine that you have a boulder that you want to shift or move, you could have a crowbar or basically a big metal bar or a rod, and then shift it. So if you press close to it, it's harder than further away. And Donella Meadows' observation is that 99% of the energy and focus is on parameters. That is very small when it comes to its leverage. And I'll go into artificial intelligence and ecocide law when it comes to that in just a minute. And you can just think about the discussion about climate change. It's a lot about targets and parameters. More leverage is if you go into processes and improve feedback. And feedback is, I would say, one of the main problems with our society today. We are so disconnected from what we're doing. We don't feel the damage we're doing with our consumption. And everything in nature has feedback built into it. And when we started to launch rockets to the moon, that is when engineers realized feedback is really important. Otherwise, the rocket will not arrive where it needs to be. So it's kind of a fundamental thing. A person that has written very interesting about this when it comes to society is Jared Diamond in his book Collapse, just an advice. And then you have design, self-organization, and intelligence in the aspect of being able to predict. And you have then worldviews as the last one. So when it comes to artificial intelligence and parameters, so you have a very powerful thing here with AI to make sense of complex data and finding best practice, both when it comes to structures and targets. And a lot of companies are struggling with this, with their ESGs, the governance systems and the management systems being designed for another world than they are currently operating. Ecocide law have a preemptive reflex at source, when or before the business case, as I said, is made. So you don't need to chase that from the top at the same extent as we are planning in the European Union, for instance. And you have, when it comes to processes, transparency, visual intelligence, to give you one example, that improves ability to get feedback and also enables us to get better sense of trust. And with Ecocide law, you get a hard stop. And you could say that a problem we have in the modern society is that we are not very sensitive to what destruction we do. And in contrast to indigenous people that know pretty well, or in the old time when we were farmers, we knew pretty well when the food was when we were out of food, or we did bad things to nature. So having a hard stop until we learn is a good idea, and that is something Ecocide brings about. When it comes to design, the ability for artificial intelligence to predict also dynamic complexity is really helpful here. And Brian Arthur of Santa Fe Institute has written very interesting and done very interesting modeling about this. But an Ecocide law is designed from the expert drafting panel, a definition that is path dependent, and progressive. So when we have disproportional damage, we create disproportional damage before it happens, it could be considered ecocide. And then as society becomes better and better at mining with precision, without footprint or whatever, Ecocide Law will follow. So it is helping the society to gently self-reorganize in a way that considers where we come from. It doesn't take us or expect us to get straight into fair land in the step. And and also I may have said that, but in itself, artificial intelligence have no moral, so it will take us, wherever we want to go. Ecocide Law establishes a moral baseline, and it has a social aspect to it. And perhaps I'll say that this example quite quickly. I didn't realize the social aspect of the morality until I heard this story from Scandinavian Airlines. They had this problem years ago when they landed the plane. You had half of the alcohol still left, half of the fantastic food they served back then, half left, and then there was a party. The staff had a party with that, and then they had to fill everything up in the morning. And it was really difficult for people to stop, not join that party, until they tried a lot of things, until they gathered people in groups. And then people could, and then because when you spoke with people individually, they said, well, of course it's wrong. Of course, it's the airlines, alcohol and food. And of course it's wrong that we party this up. But it's really difficult to change the social context. And it wasn't until they gathered people in groups and they could see and hear each other say, well, this is wrong, we should, of course, change this, that they changed. And this kind of little story, for me, made me understand the social aspect. And that is, of course, what the Rome Statute gives us an opportunity to do on the highest level. So, so it's a great complement to direct the force of and power of AI to help us. So in summary then, there's a lot of discussion for very good reason about the negative consequences of AI and the development path of society when it comes to people, democracy and planet. Well, of course, where we want to go is a society that puts the well-being of people and planet first, which is what Ecocide Law is been designed to do. And with AI, we can get there very much faster. And I'm eager to hear your responses to the report, where we have more information. And the last thing I'd like to say now is thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jonas. And I have some questions, but I also want to prioritize other people's questions. And Andre, I wonder if you have any reflections on this report, and also maybe if you could answer Jonas' question in the Q&A. I don't know if you saw it. It's about machine learning and AI and the difference between those.
Yes, so first of all, thank you very much, Jonas, for this very interesting and inspiring presentation. I would like to begin with a brief comment on your proposition. And I appreciate that you bring Donella Meadows' work into the picture here, right? And the leverage points to intervene into complex systems. I believe that the most powerful leverage point that she's pointing out is even located beyond just the cultural or social norms and values. And she's describing it as the power to transcend the paradigm. And so I think that what we should be doing here as a productive way to open up a bigger conversation is to ask ourselves, what is the paradigm that we are working on? I want to mention also, like, to my mind, there were two concepts coming up. It's kind of the idea of escalation or de-escalation. Yeah. So right now, actually, there seems to be almost an arms race between different communities to make sure that we are developing technologies for particular interests. And of course, recently the ethics and governance community has come in and brought up questions and concerns about responsible innovation. As I mentioned, these were mainly focused previously on human-centric design standards. But Jonas, you're going into a direction which is also then including the possibility of these technologies to support more environmental concerns and eco-centric approaches to tech governance, right? But there is still like a sense of an arms race. To my mind, there comes also the notion of risk society, a concept by Ulrich Beck, a philosopher of technology, who has painted a picture of a very technologically advanced society that is stuck in a cause and effect relationship to mitigate self-produced risks and uncertainties that came from the technologies that were actually developed to make life better, right? And so what we're seeing also here is the more elaborate the technology becomes, the more elaborate governance frameworks we also need to develop. And the question is, where is the end to that, right? And my question here is actually, is there also a way to view these things through the lens of de-escalation or reconciliation or rebalancing? So what is the paradigm? And to me, it's been especially interesting also to learn about Earth Law and Ecocide, as it kind of really relates to some of the ancient cosmologies and knowledge systems that actually have governed our life on Earth, that can be found in nature-based worldviews, traditional ecological knowledge, right? And the relationship, I think, is also vital here to explore. So what are the synergies and frictions between technoscientific reasoning and governance and these ancient worldviews as they also manifest in new approaches like these legal movements that are currently really the cutting edge of environmental concern? So yeah, these are just some of the reflections that I want to give here. And I'm wondering if this resonates with the group as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are very good reflections. I don't know if you, Pella, would you like to say something? Perhaps one thing just off the bat, that the thing that you said about Donna Meadows, I could have stressed that a lot more, I think, also in the report. You have it in a philosophical sense in the end of the report. I do agree. And yeah, really interesting comment. Thank you. Hand it over to you, Pella.
Oh, thank you. We always have so exciting discussions, and they tend to be on a very transcendental and philosophical level. So I just don't want to leave the more technical and definition aspects, which is from Jana in the Q&A. I don't know if you saw it, Andre. That AI is what we are generally concerned about, but the examples I've heard so far is for me more about machine learning, and that would never be let to develop their own intelligence. Or am I naive? Is there always a risk with computers learning from experience?
Yes. Yeah, I could say, I don't know if I should start, but yeah, I think this is certainly a risk. We don't really have control of the AI system, as far as I know. So we create AI systems that create other AI systems, and then it could be several levels, and it's difficult to know exactly what we created. It's a lot of discussion and conversation about that problem. So I don't think you're naive, and it needs to be managed, I think. But I'm sure, I don't know, Andrea, perhaps you have a better answer.
Well, yes, just as a disclaimer for the entire audience, I myself come from an arts and humanities background, and my research has actually approached the topic of AI also as a cultural phenomenon. That's why I opened actually the conversation also with the narratives that have shaped our understanding of these technologies. But I absolutely agree, there are fine distinctions to be made technically. AI is basically the overall phenomenon that like a technology that enables a machine to simulate intelligent behavior, and machine learning would be considered a subset of AI, right? Which allows a machine to automatically learn from past data. But however, the cultural aspect of these questions is very prevalent, because also what I proposed in my last questions of my presentation, can AI exist with, for, or as nature? It is really the question, what are the experiences that we actually train the machine with? What kind of frames of reference are we programming into them? And what are the data sets, the particular kinds of behavioral dynamics that are being modeled and simulated later on? So what you could also see from these more cultural references is that there is an attempt also to use sort of the human intelligence oftentimes as a model or a frame of reference. Is there a way, if we want to be more proactive, of addressing the positive implications or opportunities of AI? Is there a way to train AI to think like a forest, like a slime mold, like an ecosystem, right? I think there are some movements out there who are introducing the cutting edge of biomimicry to these questions, but still from an ethical and policy standpoint, I think we are far from finding a useful framework to work with. And this is exactly the point. What is the paradigm, and what are basically the narratives and context that machines are allowed to evolve their own reasoning from?
Right. Oh, thank you. It's getting more interesting now in the chat box and in the questions here. And I think something that I've been thinking about is that we are kind of going into, I mean, in the paradigm that we are in currently, we have been, in the words of the sociologist Max Weber, what is it that we have done? We have taken the soul away from the world, from nature. And I don't remember the term now, but I think it's really interesting. And also from your examples, Andre, that we're kind of putting the soul now into the machine instead. And there is a question from Louisa. I would really appreciate your input regarding AI sentience. Is that even a concern in the field? And how would that relate to Ecocide Law? So who is sentient here? Is it just humans? Is it all living beings? Is it machines? What do you say, Andre?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's really one of the hot topics, right, that are shaping this discourse for a long time already. It actually directly relates to the part of my presentation where I tried to go back to the original proposal of the Dartmouth workshop, and to also disentangle a little bit our understanding of the machine as an intelligent entity, as the original proposal was really about the notion or the attempt to create a machine that could simulate intelligent behavior. Now, later on, especially in popular science, right, the idea of exponential growth then introduced this understanding that if a computing hardware becomes increasingly capable, that kind of simulation at one point turned into an actual intelligent being or even a self-conscious entity, right? But this is, I mean, it's a very debated topic, and there is, of course, no indication that this has happened or will happen anytime soon beyond sort of a collective sense-making process about how this technology can turn out in the future. Now, I believe that also that particular piece is part of the narratives that we choose to understand the world with. And also it is part of a quite reductionist paradigm where, especially from a standpoint of computer science, there is oftentimes a belief that the entire world is basically representable by mathematical reasoning, right? And is that really so? And what would, for example, communities like those cradling traditional ecological knowledge, the cultural and spiritual dimensions of intelligence, basically respond to that? And they are often left out of this conversation on the possibilities and limitations of artificial intelligence.
That's good.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. Did you have a reflection, Jonas? I see you're typing an answer at the moment.
I was typing to Chloe's comment while listening. I have kind of the upside down view of this. I'm not so personally concerned about sentience. I think it's a distraction to some extent, personally. That they would be alive, and the notion that, but they will certainly act. AI will certainly act as and mimic behaviors that they are programmed for. So my concern, the upside down concern, is that we become more artificial ourselves. We become more like our tools and become less present in the moment, less sentient, and less, what do you say, sensitive to the conversation that the living natural world has with us. So that is kind of my concern, what it does to us, unless we shape it before it's everywhere. So yeah, but that's just my reflection.
I have a question now, building on Daniel, who put the question on data sufficiency in the chat. So addressing what you said about escalation and stopping the escalation or the great acceleration that we are in. So Daniel is talking about data sufficiency, as much data as necessary, as little data as possible. What's the corollary for AI is the question. And this also tags into what I'm always thinking about, like, so AI, yeah, it could be an interesting tech to help us to become sustainable, as you have argued, Jonas, but isn't it itself also in itself a problem, like in itself driving resource consumption, creating the need for more mining, for example, and more energy for data storage and things like that? Could you address that space, please? Maybe that's the last question, actually. Who wants to start?
Andrea, would you like to start?
I'm happy to start. I think data is such an important keyword here. And again, the question is really, what are the data, the types of data that are actually legible by a machine, and a machine can be trained with, right? More recently, we have seen, especially in the space of climate mitigation, the emergence of the so-called inner development goals, right? Or concepts such as warm data, a notion introduced by system thinker Nora Bateson, that are trying to open up a space for a different category of information that cannot be easily collected through numerical data and charts, but it's basically a more emotional response. So I do believe that yes, we need to understand what data sufficiency means in this context, and perhaps also how AI, in terms of like the data that is sufficient enough for it to provide interesting and viable models to understanding issues of Earth law and ecocide, can then be stewarded by the user or developer that needs to apply a different category of data. And these are the data that cannot be found in trying to become like a machine, right? Similar to what Jonas, you said, we need to also claim the capacity that human intelligence, emotional intelligence offers, and find new ways how to steward the opportunities that are coming to us from a technological standpoint in ways that are not overriding the sustainable systems that are basically currently under threat.
Thank you. And we are nearing the end of our session here together, and it's so great with all the questions. We're sorry that we didn't have time this time to answer all of them. I note that there is one also around concerns with AI, which is of course a huge field that we haven't almost touched upon here today. I just wanted to note that I'm quite flabbergasted, Andre, that the ethical frameworks concerning AI so far has been so anthropocentric. And I do think that there is actually a paradigm shift in quality, since anthropocentrism is such a fundamental assumption in the paradigm we are living. So by questioning that, we are also questioning a whole paradigm in line with, for example, as you also raised, indigenous thinking and indigenous worldviews. So incredibly rich field. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jonas, for your work with the report. You got the link in the chat, and I think you will also get an email with it after this. So this is the beginning of something that we want to continue to explore. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.